My wife Jill and I live in Lancaster County, and we belong to the Greek Orthodox church called Annunciation. And in our church, we're converts. Our last name is Miller, but in our church we're known as Miller, as in Ian Miller. So we're not quite as animated as the Greeks you may have heard today. And we are from Lancaster County, and something happened in our county about 10 years ago that I'm going to talk about in the story. But first, I want to say that when I became a resident in family practice in 1976, I read a book by, I believe he was an Orthodox social critic, Ivan Illich. The book was Medical Nemesis. And he said, over the ages, the cultures dealt with suffering with practices and expectations and provisions of meaning and comfort. But modern societies have medicalized suffering, and we've lost our spiritual moorings in managing suffering. And this paper will look at how the traditional community, the Amish of Lancaster County, responded to a traumatic loss in 2006 when a gunman entered a defenseless schoolhouse and shot 10 young girls, 6 to 13 years old. The Amish response to this traumatic loss was a result of practices of their faith in daily life that mirrors the Orthodox Christian practices of ascesis. I'll mangle the Greek words I'm going to use here, sorry. But repetitive prayer, daily remembrance of death, remembrance of martyrs' stories, and self-emptying love for God and the other are the practices that you can find in the Amish community. Charles Roberts was 32 years old on October 2nd, 2006, when he plotted to enter the peaceful Amish schoolhouse in Nickel Mines. It was a one-room schoolhouse in a place called Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania, close to where we lived, to murder innocent Amish girls. He was a milk truck driver who lived among the Amish and collected milk from their farms. He was known to be a quiet and reliable Christian man with evidence of a compassionate heart. However, over time he harbored bitterness toward God as a result of the death of years prior of his daughter, who died minutes after her birth. In a suicide note to his family, he vowed to punish some Christian girls in revenge against God. So he parked his truck outside the schoolhouse, and he entered it, brandishing a gun. He dismissed the school teacher and the boys, and then began to barricade the schoolhouse windows and doors and bind the remaining girls on the floor. There are 10 girls. He intended to molest them sexually, but the police had been alerted by the fleeing teacher and were beginning to arrive on the scene. That's when Robert started to shoot the girls one by one. In all, 10 girls between the ages of 6 and 13 were shot. 5 died, and 5 survived with injuries. Only minutes went by, but by the time the state police were able to break down the barricades, Roberts had turned the gun on himself and died. Donald Crable is a local expert on the Amish, and in his book, Amish Grace, which I'd really recommend to read because he's written it so sympathetically, so wonderfully. And he co-authored this with 2 other people, Stephen Nolt and David Weaver Zerker. He says, in one sense, no community is ever prepared for such a calamity. There have been few murders in the Amish history, and never before had there been a schoolhouse massacre. At the same time, the Amish are better prepared than most Americans to deal with a tragedy like this. The Amish are a close-knit community, woven together by strong ties of family, faith, and culture. Members in distress can tap this rich reservoir of communal care through, even during horrific events. The immediate response of the Amish community was to forgive Charles Roberts of this horrific and senseless loss and reach out to his family and support them. Hours after Charles Roberts shot these 10 girls, a group of Amish men approached the house of his wife, now a widow. She was panicked, not sure how to respond to these men who likely came in anger. Instead, they came to Mrs. Roberts with tender words of forgiveness, which set in motion an extraordinary journey of faith and forgiveness. There were many tears and embraces that were shared between the Amish and the Roberts family right after the shooting and far beyond. The Amish community quickly realized the Roberts widow and the children were also victims of this violence. And within hours, they told the family that they held nothing against them or Charles. Realizing also that the Roberts family was now without income, they made donations to the family and shared some of the money that started pouring into the Amish community from around the world. It was in order to help with their medical expenses of the surviving girls. But they shared that money with the Roberts family. Over half the people at Charles's funeral were Amish. A warm relationship developed between the Amish and the Roberts family, and both parties have experienced healing and have seen lives changed over the last 10 years because of the Amish response of forgiveness that was immediate and thorough. The story of the Amish forgiveness rapidly spread around the world when the media converged on Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania. How were the Amish able to offer forgiveness so lovingly and unflinchingly? You know, it was not a mandate from the bishops, nor was it a gimmick to try to get some publicity. It came out of a life lived daily with a form of ascesis, or a lifestyle of training and struggle in Christian practices that is very familiar to us Orthodox Christians, but foreign to most Western Christians. With observation of Amish practices of plain dress and a refusal to drive cars or have electricity, you can kind of see an ascetic lifestyle that kind of mirrors that of monks. The overarching theme of Amish spirituality is Gelassenheit, a German word that means the posture of yieldedness, which is expressed in obedience to the rule of the community, yielding to one another, renouncing self-defense, and giving up the desire for justification or efforts at revenge. And furthermore, children are brought up in a world soaked in rituals and habits that express submission and endorse self-surrender. The humility and self-emptying reflected in the word kenosis is the foundation of Orthodox spirituality as well. Elder Joseph says, active love without submission cannot exist. How can you love and serve if you don't first submit to the other's will? Father Anthony Conieris, in his book Philokalia, the Bible of Orthodox Spirituality, says, ascesis is a struggle to renounce my ego, which looks at the world as existing only to satisfy my needs and desires. This runs totally counter to our individualistic culture that prizes independence and self-sufficiency and self-promotion. The ethos of Gelassenheit is absorbed when Amish learn the stories of martyrs as children, told repeatedly from the book Martyr's Mirror, which I have. It's just this little book. And it starts with the martyrs of, like, St. Stephen, goes through the martyrs that we know in our tradition, too. And it includes the martyrs that were recorded in Holland, the Anabaptist martyrs who lost their lives for their faith, too. This book is really familiar to Amish children who also read these stories. Crable says that the stories offer flesh and blood blueprints for how to lead lives that are yielded to God. The place of these stories in Amish culture echo the place that stories of the saints and the martyrs hold in our spiritual tradition, too. These stories induced the eldest of the Amish martyrs, Miriam Fisher, a girl who was 13 years old, to beg Charles Roberts to shoot her first. She wanted to have him, we think, spend his wrath on her first and spare the younger children. Miriam was the first to die. Crable says, the Amish martyr heritage nourishes an ethic of non-retaliation and love of the enemy. They want to die as Jesus did, praying for their persecutors and forgiving them. And Bishop Callisto Ware says, the only triumph that the church on earth can or should expect is martyrdom. While the Orthodox strive to pray without ceasing, keeping the faithful's focus on submission to God by using the Jesus Prayer. The Amish use the Lord's Prayer much in the same way. It is recited every morning at breakfast and again at school. It is said silently before every meal and is used in every church service, wedding, funeral, and evening prayers. It's the first thing a child memorizes. When prayer is called for, the Lord's Prayer is used, rather than composing a prayer in the moment, which would be seen as a prideful display of one's righteousness. The crucial part of the Lord's Prayer is forgiveness, which is emphasized by the Amish. They believe that they will not be forgiven if they do not forgive. One elder explains emphatically, forgiveness is the only thing that Jesus underscored in the Lord's Prayer. It's the only part of the prayer for which he provided commentary in Matthew 6:14 through 15, when he said, "For if you forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive you your trespasses." The father of a girl who died at nickel mines said, "Forgiveness means giving up your right to revenge." Forgiveness is a central requirement for participating in communion. Forgiveness is not an option, but an enduring expectation. Forgiveness is essential to Orthodox spirituality as well, given the recurring request for forgiveness each Sunday by the priest of the congregation, the Forgiveness Sunday ritual practiced in most Orthodox churches, the Sundays of the Prodigal Son and the Samaritan Woman, the practice of confession, and on and on. Archimandrite Seraphim said, "Bitterness and strife make the soul unfit to bear divine grace." Orthodox Christians are continually reminded to ask for forgiveness and to forgive. Father Vasileios Thermos, who was here last year, points out that authentic forgiveness flows from our sense of the truth of our humanity, that we are connected to one another. Resentment disrupts the unity of human nature, so it also is impossible to be united to God. No matter how many prayers one recites or how many good works one presents, unless one forgives. Finally, remembrance of death is an Orthodox spiritual tool that is foreign to Western culture and Western Christianity. St. Hesychios of Sinai said, "The unremitting remembrance of death is a powerful trainer of body and soul." St. John Climacus says, "No one who has acquired the remembrance of death will ever be able to sin." The thought of death is the most essential of all works. Remembrance of death is actually practiced daily by the Amish. And surprisingly, the students in Nickel Mines School prophetically sang this song. I don't have the tune to this song, so you're spared, happily. But they sang this song the very morning that they were shot, before the intruder even came in. The song goes, "Consider, man, the end. Consider your death. Death comes quickly. He who today is vigorous and ruddy may tomorrow or sooner have passed away." What effect does forgiveness and renunciation of bitterness have on suffering of a traumatic loss such as this, or the loss and trauma of a terrorist attack? There are some small studies that show that there's some benefit of forgiveness in mitigating some of the symptoms related to PTSD. The quality of forgiveness, however, is really difficult to measure, and suffering really defies quantification and goes well beyond certain symptoms. Taking a single variable and observing its effect on outcomes is a Western way of dissecting reality and trying to control it. But maybe it's not something we can really control. How can one measure the authenticity or quality of forgiveness or of love, or how much suffering was ameliorated by the expressions of forgiveness? Really, the most powerful evidence comes from the statements of the family of Charles Roberts and the Amish who offered them forgiveness. And this was recorded 10 years later in our local newspaper, October 1st, 2016. The paper exclaimed, "Over the next decade, light would come back into the life of both Marie Roberts, Charles' wife, and Terry Roberts, his mother. Both of them say the immediate An unexpected display of concern and forgiveness by the Nickel Mines Amish served as an inspirational turning point in surviving the emotional ordeal of the shootings and moved them towards eventual healing. Both women say they felt the hand of God enter their minds and hearts to give them strength. Terry Roberts says that the grace showed by the Amish allowed her to forgive her own son the evil he had acted upon. She says forgiveness frees us to move forward, but it doesn't take away the pain. It just helps us negotiate the next step. In the last 10 years, a bond has been nurtured between the Roberts family and the Amish. They've visited each other's homes and share many meals and times of remembering that day in October 2006. Terry Roberts regularly visits Rosanna, a girl who survives with a severe head injury and now requires around-the-clock care in her parents' home. Terry helps with some of her nursing care and has become close to the family. A father with 2 sons who escaped the shootings that day says, "She's been a light to us in many ways. Though some ambivalence remains, the commitment to forgiveness made that day 10 years ago continues." An Amish bishop says, "Yes, we did forgive, but did we do it right? You have to do it over and over again." A few of the parents of the girls who were shot have traveled to other mass shootings, for example, at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Connecticut, to console the parents of victims and give advice. One Amish mother who lost a daughter says, "There is peace in forgiveness that actually helps to ease the pain because you're not feeding upon the bitterness of negative feelings." An Amish father who lost 2 daughters said, "I might have questioned my faith some, but we need to make a choice and not dwell upon bitterness. As we make a choice, I want to do better, and I think this has helped me." As a physician, I've witnessed often the bitterness that people nurture when hard things come into their lives. Suffering in those lives seems magnified, and it can't be relieved by medications or counseling. In most circumstances, the person suffering are ill-equipped to respond to suffering with grace. The expected response in our culture is to raise a fist in anger towards God and fellow man. We do not have the resources to move on to forgiveness. Faithfulness in suffering is a central challenge for us Christians. To avoid raising a fist in bitterness requires ascesis that includes daily prayer, remembrance of death, a community that practices and encourages humility and submission, and stories that reinforce a Christian faithfulness to God, no matter what comes our way. I feel our Orthodox faith is under pressure by the prevailing culture to accept the culture's assumptions and to live by its worldview. And my hope in bringing this story to OCAMPR is to reinforce our own spiritual practices in ascesis, to remind each other of the need to cultivate a culture that responds in a Christ-like way, to remember to teach our children the important lessons of our faith, to model them ourselves, and to incorporate the stories of the martyrs and the saints into the fabric of our lives so that our responses to hardships and insults and loss will proceed from a heart prepared to be faithful. Like so many of our passions, the passion that raises its fist against God and man can atrophy, like the other passions, through the phronema of faithfulness. It is only through these daily ascetic practices that we'll be able to respond as Christ did when it's our turn to suffer, and it will be our turn. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions?
Thank you for a wonderful presentation and story. It seems to me that the whole phenomenon in this Amish story is relates to forgiveness, and that forgiveness has to be a process. And I can't understand that process of going from the grief and to actually emotionally being ready to forgive. There just seems to be too much in between. to just jump from one point to the other, to the loss, to the forgiveness. One possibility that occurred to me, but it would be a very complex one, is that forgiveness would involve the capacity, the empathic capacity to understand the person who murdered your child. And how could anybody suffering that loss be ready right away to understand the person who murdered their child?
Yeah, I think that was a real struggle for the Amish who lost their children that day. There was one woman who went, these Amish don't have cars, so they had to get rides to the hospitals where their children were taken. They were taken to tertiary centers. One was taken to Hershey Medical Center, and another one was taken to Christiana, which was miles, 60 miles away or something like that, by helicopter. And they didn't have even cell phones at that point to communicate with each other. So they would run to one hospital. Is my child here? No, she's in this other hospital. This particular mother lost both daughters. She went to Hershey first, and that child died in her arms. And she heard the other one was in Christiana. She got a ride to Christiana only in time for that daughter to die in her arms as well. So I don't know how they did it, but I think you're right. There had to be anger, there had to be bitterness swelling up immediately, and lack of understanding of how this happened. But I think it was this daily practice of saying we're going to do this no matter what, and we do this every day, and this is our calling and our job. That they committed to it immediately, and they did it with physical acts. It wasn't like a note written, well, I'm sorry for your loss or something. It was, they were taking meals to the Roberts family that night. They were approaching them and hugging them and crying together with them for both of their losses. So yeah, it's beyond my understanding too, because I've not lived this life that they have lived. But I think it's really an encouragement and a hope to me that we need to find ways of doing that ourselves in our own communities, because it's there. It's there in the way we understand our Christian life. And it's a commitment. Like the one Amish bishop said, I don't know if I did it right. I'm going to keep on committing to it. And it's a commitment that they continue to do.
Thank you very much. This concept of forgiveness is something which I've been practicing as a monk since I entered the monastery 25 years ago. And I'm a 21st century American, so this was not common to me. Yet in our rubrics at the end of midnight office, which we have early in the morning, the senior monk comes to the front of the church and bows to all the rest of the community, saying, "Forgive me for all that I've done against you this past night in word, deed, and thought, and all my feelings." And then later in the day, as we close with Compline, he does the same thing. And so we're practicing this active, physical asking of forgiveness, because we ask also in return, forgive me for anything I've done. Because as human beings, it's very easy for us to hurt each other without even knowing it. To step on each other's toes, to hurt each other's feelings by, the shade of a word. And what I really have come to realize is that for me, forgiveness is not necessarily letting the other person off the hook, because it's up to God to judge, but it relieves me of those hooks, of that feeling, But once I can forgive, and this practice doing it every day, however, it took me a number of years actually for it to start to flow. And so I appreciate what the bishop said too, that he's not sure if he got it right, so he'll just keep continuing to do it. So it is part of our tradition. And I also appreciate very much Gregory of Nyssa, who wrote about the Lord's Prayer. And he said, forgive others as you would have God forgive you. That's the key to the kingdom of heaven for us. We could say just that one word or that one phrase, and that's the Lord's Prayer. That's the whole essence of it. So thank you very much.
I know I speak quite often about my practice in eating disorders, but there was a specific exercise in the program Family Intensive that I ran there, and it went with just the simple words. I'm sorry, I did ABCD. How did you feel? will you forgive me? And what do you need? Will you forgive me? And just that part, and that family intensive took 3 days in a week, 9 a.m. until 5 p.m. So they learned and shared a lot of time together, and in the end, that was the conclusion, basically. And it opened so many wounds and kind of let people breathe and hug and cry. It created miracles, and it was the program that was rated in the 97th percentile of excellence. So, there is nothing miraculous other than there is something outside of us. I mean, I don't want to, there is no logical explanation, basically, other than there is, God is working into this. We're just asking for forgiveness, and we're just practicing simple human love, letting go.
I can't emphasize the power enough of stories, because I don't remember where I read this years ago, but it really impacted me, and I should know where I got it, but I'm not smart enough to write things down when I hear about it. But the person I heard speaking about this said that it's our stories that really help us to act. We could have all this other cognitive stuff going on, and we can hear a great sermon or something about forgiveness, but when we hear a story, it impacts our minds at a different spot and our souls at a different spot, so that the story causes us to do something that we don't even have to think about. It comes naturally to us because we remember what so-and-so did in this book, The Martyr's Mirror. There was a story that the Amish girls knew about a man who was captured and was going to be put to death in the 17th century by some Dutch religious folks for his beliefs. So he was on the run, and he was being chased by the folks who were going to put him to death. He ran across the ice. He made it. The guy behind him, chasing him, didn't. He fell through the ice. He was going to die. This man turned around and saved his life by pulling him out of the ice. And as a reward, this man was burned at the stake. Our man who pulled the man out of the ice was burned at the stake. But the Amish girls knew that story. They knew that story by heart. That was told again and again and again. And there was another story about a man who, during the Revolutionary War, had a guy that he was picking at him all the time. He was a man who was all for the revolution, and he was picking at this Mennonite guy, Amish guy actually, who was refusing to go to war, and bad-mouthing him to all the neighbors and everything. Well, later on, he was kind of a scoundrel, the man who was bad-mouthing him, and he was caught as a deserter to with Washington's troops, and Washington was going to hang him. Our Mennonite Amish friend in Lancaster County heard about this, so he went to Virginia to plead to Washington to say, "Don't hang this man." I guess it was Virginia, someplace far away. "Don't hang this man. I'll stand in his place." And Washington said to him, "Wow, that's a wonderful thing you're going to do for your friend, but we're still going to hang him." And this Amish Mennonite man said, "Friend? He's my enemy." And Washington was so moved by that, he let him off the hook. And the man who was freed said, "Why did you do that?" He said, "Because we were told to do that. We were told to love our enemies, and I'm glad you're free, and I'm just happy that you didn't have to get what was coming to you." And they became fast friends, and a relationship developed. These stories were available to the Amish children, and that's what they heard from day to day.
I'm not knowledgeable of the Amish culture, but have the impression that the forgiveness is part of a package. It's a piece of an entire culture and way of life. And that culture must have a point of view about our culture that may influence the values and behavior in the Amish culture. Am I making any sense?
Jill has an idea here. She helped me with this, by the way.
Yeah, that was talked about in the book, in Amish Grace. And they even acknowledged that before this event, there was more of a separation. There was the English, which is all of us, and the Amish. And through this event, there was more of a separation and sort of a them and us. But through this event, they became closer, and they acknowledged that they became closer. And there was an Amish accountability committee formed because all in all, $4 million were donated from the world to this community, which they also shared with the Roberts. So they wanted to make sure that this was, that all resources that were given to them were going to be handled responsibly. So then this committee wrote a thank you letter that was published in the local paper. Then they also wrote a letter that was published in their Amish publication, just thanking everyone, especially the state police. The state police protected them as each family went to the gravesite. You know, this would be a procession of horse and buggy. And, of course, the media is everywhere. They're afraid of tourists. But the state police kept them free from any interference. They kept each home free from any interference. So they were very, very grateful for that privacy, that chance to grieve. They thanked the English specifically. They just meant the whole world, the English community, for their gifts, for their understanding. And they said, we are now, in the words of one of the Amishmen, he said, we are all Amish. So I just thought that was so powerful. And the other thing I wanted to bring up is we've talked about how do you respond to pain and suffering, and what do we say? Well, they said what happened with each family within, hours. The church community for each family would take over all their chores as hundreds of people over the next couple of days came to their house, hundreds. And what they would do, they would say there'd be a few words of condolence, but it's mostly just silent presence. And that's what they expect to happen. Everyone knows that's what will happen, and that is what gives them strength.
I might add one comment to your question, if I may, about forgiveness and how do we forgive like they did so quickly. And perhaps part of it might be a recognition of our own brokenness and our own trespasses, to see the sin that has been committed and what we have done in our own lives. That might also help prompt us to forgiveness, I would suggest.